We need to wrap up a few components on the motor. We left off the muffler and the carburetor just to make it easier to work on the model. Time to put that on, as well as the spark plug and the ignition system. You may or may not have an EI system. The HWC motors all come with it. The standard PUH motors have a coil on the side as with a magneto, so no additional power supply is needed. Also in the muffler, there's all sorts of mufflers available, including a canister muffler that Zenoa provides. This particular one is made by Century, comes with some versions of the motor. You'll need the mounting hardware, which usually comes with it. And on the carburetor side, I highly recommend you use an air filter of some sort. Again, the HWC motors come with them. Most of the modified motors come with air filters because it's highly recommended to use one. So these are the parts we're going to put on the chassis, on the motor. Now, whatever muffler you have, it's going to mount onto the exhaust port on the cylinder, which will be right here. You want to make sure that there's plenty of clearance between the tank, between the frame, between all parts, because this will get incredibly hot. If you use the standard Zenoa gasket, you really won't need any sealer because the gasket has a soft material on it which basically sticks to both sides. Here you can see the muffler mounted. It's tightened down. Normally what you'll find is when you run the motor, you'll want to tighten it up while it's hot. You'll want to tighten it again when it's cool. You want to do that for a couple of cycles. Once you've done that, it'll pretty much stay in place. There are supports that can be mounted on the back of the muffler. The Radikal actually comes with a component to do that. I'm not a big fan of it, so I'm not going to show you how it's done. The manual does include a procedure for doing that. I'm going to make sure you've got the spark plug installed. Make sure it's snugged down so it won't come loose. Make sure it's a resistor plug. Most of the motors come with it. You just need to make sure it's good and tight. Now that you got the spark plug in, some motors are going to have a coil mounted here on the side with the plug wire that just comes out. You can thread it right through this hole here, connect it right over the plug, and that'll solve that. If you have an EI system, then we're going to have to find a place to mount this box so that you can get it connected to the plug. If you've got an EI system, you're going to have to mount it somewhere. There's lots of places you can mount it. In my case, I found that right under the battery tray here is a great place. Using two-sided tape and Velcro, just push it on. Make sure you're not restricting any of the wires, and strap it into place like so. And then you'll need to route the wires and make the connections. One last thing about the EI system, you need to connect the trigger from the motor to the trigger wire in the unit. That can go between the cooling shroud and the motor frame because it's insulated. Feed it up and connect them together. I'm a big fan of Velcro and tie wraps, so I put those parts here. There's really no standard for how you do this. You can do it however you want. Alright, the carburetor is going to obviously go on the inlet side of the motor. There's a stack you're going to put together. Depending on what carburetor air filter you're using, there's usually some sort of mount plate that'll have a gasket between it. You may have Teflon gaskets like this one does, which goes between the carburetor and the isolator block. It's critically important that you line the holes up on anything that goes between the carburetor and the cylinder, because there's a pump port, a little hole here. It makes the pump in the carburetor work. If you don't line this up properly, the carburetor won't pump fuel, motor won't run, and you'll spend a lot of time trying to figure out why. This just bolts right onto the isolator block, threads on. You're going to make sure this is This is good and tight. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to kill it, but you do need to make sure it's snug. One of the things you have to worry about when you mount the carburetor is these bolts go into the isolator block. And depending on what isolator block you have and how it's connected, it may have some Teflon gaskets in back of it. The HWC system does. If these bolts are too long, they'll actually push out the back of the gasket between the isolator block and the cylinder, and it'll cause an air leak. And it'll only really be a problem when the motor's hot, which means you'll be flying, and you'll just fight endlessly trying to get to the bottom of a mixture problem that's caused entirely by an air leak. So when you're putting this on, make sure you look at these gaskets really closely. Make sure the bolt's not too long. So you want to have an air filter of some sort on your motor just to avoid getting a lot of dirt in it, especially if it hits the ground for some reason. Those attach in all different ways. If you're using the Century air filter, it threads onto this fixture that you bolted on the outside of the carburetor. Just threads into the end of it. I'd use some RTV to keep it from coming loose. There's a logo on this thing that if you have that lined up correctly will align parallel with the motor. If it's inverted and you don't want it to be inverted, then simply spin it back off and turn this plate around. Take the bolts out, turn it upside down, and it'll line up just fine. Okay, with that, the model is mechanically pretty complete. I still need to plumb the fuel tank. Everything's on the motor. It's ready to run once the servos are connected to it.